Well, welcome, or I should say welcome back to York. And now let's talk about vice. What is your favorite vice? This is a very personal question. Some of you would tell me, others would say, I'm willing to share with you my favorite vice, but I don't want to do it before such a large audience. Well, I want to reassure you, I don't plan, to go and ask you what is your favorite vice. And the reason I don't plan to do that, it's not that I'm arrogant or I don't care about what you think. The Globe and Mail did it for me. 2 years in a row. 2 years in a row, those who read the Globe and Mail were invited to indicate what their vice or vices were. And in 2012, those who read the Globe and Mail, 1,900 of them said, well, my favorite vice is to eat junk food. Others said impulse shopping, although if you did it yesterday, that was a great thing since it was Black Friday. Porn, some of you would say, not surprised that porn, appears there. And then you have nail biting, and it's funny, on the bus that brought me to York this morning, someone told me, my mom told me that nail biting was a vice. And I said, no, it is not a vice. Let me reassure you, it is not a vice. And he's now 60. He said it took me 60 years to find out that it was not a vice. But the last one, which is interesting, not telling. Then people reluctant to say what their favorite vice. And then the following year, this is interesting because it's more or less the same answers, but the only category where there is a slight increase, it's the last one, not telling. Then the percentage of individuals unwilling to share, their vice, instead of decreasing, went the opposite way. It increased. Why am I showing this? It's, I think, for more than 500 years, we have been talking about vice in this country, in this land. And of course, the evolution, not the evolution, but the meaning of vice has changed over time. If I had this ability to take you with me back in time, and let's say we were downtown Toronto in 1816, probably someone who would give you a lecture on vice would refer to this. It would, refer to this definition that, refer to, the depravity or corruption of morals. Then there is a reference to morality, evil, immoral, or wicked habits or conduct, indulgence in degrading pleasures or practices. And the words that you have, on this screen did shape the way Canadians have looked at certain behaviors, and they label those behaviors as vice. And since we are talking about vice, often people would refer to those 7 deadly vices or those 7 deadly sins. Maybe some of you know them by heart. Anger, greed, envy, pride, lust. But while developing first a course at the undergraduate level, and then the book Canada the Good, I found out that there are more than 7. Then if you go online and you check Princeton University, you check the index of Christian art, you will discover that there is a long list of vices. And here we are, we have ambition. Some of you would say this is not a vice. In fact, it's a quality that we should encourage individuals to develop. Bad habit, which is quite general. In fact, we could say everything that I judge unacceptable could be labeled bad habit. You have blasphemy, disobedience, drunkenness, fornication, and then here we are: impatience, infidelity, intemperance, lust, obscene speech, pleasure, poverty, plus 100 more behaviors labeled as vices. Well, of course, we have lunch at noon, and I don't plan to cover all those vices. But I'll tell you what I plan to do this morning. First, the first question I may have is it still relevant in 2015 to use the term, vice? Because some of you would say, every time we refer to vice, there is, a direct reference to Christianity, and we cannot deny the fact that, Christianity did shape the way that this country has evolved. Maybe the impact of Christianity is not as profound as it used to be, because Canadian population has changed over the years, its composition, etc. But you may be surprised if you do, right after, this talk, you go on Google or you check on your iPhone and you enter, the term vice, you'll be surprised how often the term is still used. And there are, two pieces that were published a couple of years ago. The first one is a very interesting one. Vices pay if you have a stake in them. And it's basically, it's an article that gives you some useful information if you want to invest money and you expect good return on your investment. What you should do is you invest in tobacco companies. Of course, any companies involved in booze. And the third one, then there was booze, there was, tobacco, and then suddenly the third one escapes my mind. It's not that I do not want to conceal this piece of information because I don't want you to invest, but it will come back to me. However, people are still reluctant to invest, in, gambling, anything that has to do with gambling. Then, tobacco, gambling, and booze. But apparently, we are reluctant to invest, in tobacco, gambling, and drinking because we fear maybe the judgment that others may pass on us, saying, are you not ashamed, investing in tobacco? Are you not ashamed investing, drinking, gambling? And I think it's due to the fact that for more than 500 years, we have been told again and again that these behaviors, especially smoking, this is an unacceptable, habit, etc. The other one, vices top oil and gas revenues in Alberta. This is interesting, 2010. Here we are in 2015. As you know, the oil industry in Alberta is not performing quite well. But vices here refer again to gambling and drinking. And here we are, terms that we thought were, something that belonged to the past that are still, being used. Vice. Well, when you look at this, some of you would say, well, what I see, it's people, the ones on top, it's two Chinese individuals, smoking opium. And I would not use the term vice. I'll probably use the term maybe dependence if they do it on a regular basis. But at the end of the 19th century, there were individuals who look at that behavior and said, no, this is a vice. Why it's a vice is because they're trying to escape reality. If there is one thing that life has taught us, it's how hard life is. And you should not try to find means to escape the fact that life is difficult. And the one at the bottom, well, it's a group of men who are doing terrible things. I know some of you would say they're not doing terrible things, they seem to have a good time. They are not having a good time because what they were doing, they were smoking, they were drinking, and they were gambling. Why are those things, bad? Well, they are bad because if you gamble, this means you're basically going against, this Protestant ethic, hard work. What makes you? How can you become, rich and respectable? It's by working hard. Well, if you gamble, you will not be able, to become respectable. On the contrary, you will probably lose everything you have earned, and then it will have terrible social consequences for your family. Drinking, especially in the mind of those who believe that drinking was an unacceptable behavior, either in public or in private. Well, if you drink, once under the influence of alcohol, you would commit horrible things, such as you will probably gamble, you'll probably smoke, you'll probably, encounter, a lady of the night and spend the night with that lady. And you will probably go and come back home, and your wife, your partner would expect, to see the money that you have earned, and guess what? The money has disappeared overnight. Then at the end of the 19th century, what I've described in this picture, for many, that all those behaviors not only were unacceptable, but they were, a good example of vice. And what I want to do this morning is I want to get a sense of who have pushed for the regulation of vice. Who are those people, when they look at the pictures I've shown to you, were quite saddened. And not only they were saddened, but they felt that as a citizen in this country, I had to do something in order to make sure that those behaviors would no longer be on display. Why? Why did they do that? Why did they become so, eager to move things around? And then enforcement. Then let's start with, the who. Who have pushed for, the regulation of vice? Well, probably some of you would say, I'm not surprised, since, there is such an important Christian component when we look at the definition of vice. We should not be surprised that, Christian organizations, Protestant denominations, Catholic Church, have been among the groups, among the individuals that push for the regulation of behaviors labeled as vice. But other people that you may have heard of, or you may be surprised because you would say, what, I've never thought of that. Two women, let's talk about Emily Murphy. Some of you may know her. She was a leading figure at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century in Canada. She was a feminist, and she was, a leading figure in the feminist movement. She wanted women to get the right to vote. And one of the arguments that she used for that, she said, if women had the right to vote, look at all the fantastic achievements, we could do as a society. We could ban gambling. We could, make the consumption of alcohol, a criminal act. We can, go after smokers. We can go after, prostitutes, etc. She became a judge in Alberta, and then she wrote a book called The Black Candle. And that book, for those of you who may not believe in the power of books, sometimes you can write a book that would reshape not only the understanding that society has of an issue, but also could move politicians to do something. She wrote a book in 1923, The Black Candle, and basically that book, it's about marijuana and why marijuana should be a criminal substance. And following the publication of this book, Mackenzie King, who was the prime minister of the country, felt that as a prime minister, he had to do something, and marijuana became a criminal substance. The other woman that I want to talk to you, it's Letitia Humans, leading figure in the feminist movement. She was part of the Young Women Christian Association. She wrote a book called, Campaign Echoes, and in that book, she's talking about, the temperance movement. And at the beginning of her book, she talks about, her personal story, her personal, relationship with alcohol. Her husband was drunk all the time. Came back, from work, he was drunk, and then one day, her kids found in front of the house, that was during summer, found in front of the family house an empty bottle. Then she seized the opportunity to bring the kids around with the empty bottle, and she made them swear that they would never touch again, not them, but they would never touch this alcohol ever in their life. Then she was extremely efficient in mobilizing not only other women, but Canadians in general in this temperance movement end of the 19th century. And as you know, for a brief period of time between 1918 in 1919, alcohol was prohibited in Canada. More recently, because the two examples that I give you, it's the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, you may have heard of Candy Lightner, or maybe not, but I'm sure you have heard of Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Again, it's Candy Lightner. Her daughter was killed by a drunk driver, an American, who felt compelled to do something, that it was unacceptable to let those individuals drunk to take their car. Then she started MAD, and as you know, MAD, there is Canadian chapters in every chapter, in every province, and she has been quite successful in making drunk driving behavior totally unacceptable. And there is, you may have heard of this gentleman, Jean-Marie de Coninck, university professor of mathematics at Laval University. And he started, something that we hear about in December. It's called, Red Nose, Operation Red Nose. And the goal is, if you are anywhere, outside of your home, or even if you are at a friend's home, you had a couple of drinks and you don't want, to drive because, as you know, this is a criminal offense. Well, you can call, Operation Red Nose, and then some people will come and drive you back home. But other people that, we forget about, because every time we talk about vice and this social mobilization to get rid of them, often it's people like us in this room who, felt compelled to do something. Most of the time, politicians did not want to touch those issues. That it was not, politicians who woke up one morning who said, you know what, let's get rid of drunk driving. It's, individuals who were, successful enough in convincing others, in launching, a social movement that would translate into, the regulation of a specific behavior labeled as vice. Why are they doing that? Well, they are doing that often because of personal, stories. They are doing it often because of personal convictions, but they are doing it because they really believe that they would be able to build a better society. Then I've already mentioned to you, this issue about, opium. It was, this notion that you can escape reality by consuming, a drug. I would not come back and talk again about this picture, but as I said in this picture, you had, three behaviors that for some were unacceptable, behaviors. Here I have more. Of course, the first two on your left, it's, the temperance movement. This is something, often when I talk to the students, and students feel that we are not doing much when it comes to the environment, I say, not that I'm in favor of, the temperance movement, but when you think about it, we started to talk about temperance in this country around 1820. And it was only during World War I that governments, started to get serious on the issue of, prohibition. Then think about it, it took, almost, 100 years for individuals to mobilize others in order to put enough pressure on political institutions to make, the regulation of alcohol an important, issue. And that was before, the invention of the internet, the invention of cell, social media, etc. Then we are talking of, social movements that would take a long period of time to, to not only to mobilize, but to be successful. But once they were successful, of course, they did not want, to give up. And when we abandoned, the prohibition of alcohol, these people did not disappear overnight. They wanted to make sure that if alcohol could not be regulated in the way that they wanted it, we have to limit, we had to restrict, access to it. Two others, I like these two cartoons because the first one, it's about, marijuana, and it illustrates, the changing, meaning that now we associate with the consumption of marijuana. If in, the 20s, Murphy was successful in convincing, Mackenzie King that we had to criminalize marijuana, well, now, as you know, we have, there is an attempt to legalize. Trudeau has been elected. We shall see what will happen. But what is interesting, it's those who are pushing for the legalization of marijuana. They now, they have changed, the nature of the arguments in order to respond to those who believe that marijuana is still, a terrible substance that you could not consume because it could have, devastating effect on your brain. Then you have, this senior going to the pharmacy asking, for a marijuana pill because this is what her physician prescribed to her. The one at the bottom is an interesting one. It's about tobacco. If you remember when I showed you the picture, the men smoking, drinking, I told you smoking, for some it was a vice. At the end of the 19th century, you had, some Christians, some women who believed that smoking was a terrible sin. Why? Because you were basically inflicting a pain to your body. There were no studies at the time making a link between smoking and cancer. But they were already in an attempt to say we should ban, smoking. We should, if it's impossible to ban it for everyone, we should maybe make it impossible for kids to have access to tobacco. Well, up until the 1960s, tobacco was a non-issue in the sense that, in fact, people were encouraged to smoke. If you wanted to become a man, you better smoke. It was, part of the process of, growing up. Even, women, they claimed, starting in the 20s, well, if you want, to be a new woman, a liberated woman, you should start, smoking. Well, in the 60s, with the emergence of studies linking, cigarette use and cancer, well, there has been, a push coming, from individuals, coming from various groups in favor of, the regulation of tobacco. Something I remember when I was an undergraduate student in the early 80s, the prof smoking in the classroom, something that we don't do anymore. But here we are, tobacco, an interesting case where it was labeled as a vice. Now some may still use the term vice, but now we talk more of, a bad habit or health danger, etc. And now the last thing. Well, well, I'm not showing you this because I want you to go around and say, here's a vice. No, the reason I'm showing you this, first, I'm glad that you're able to recognize him. We have not forgotten him yet. It's more something that the author of the book wrote. It's, Toronto police looked the other way on several occasions when Ford was pulled over during driving drunk. 2 senior members of the Toronto police had pulled over the mayor's car late at night on multiple occasions and driven him home rather than charging him for driving under the influence. Again, the reason I'm showing it, it's not because of who Ford was. It's because of what is being mentioned to us. Then here we are, we have an individual who is not supposed to be above the law, but you had some Toronto police officers who decided not to arrest him because they did not want him to be charged, not to be embarrassed, etc. Well, this raises an interesting question, and it's the whole issue of enforcement. Then once you have criminalized marijuana, once you have made driving under the influence of alcohol a criminal offense, once you have made tobacco smoking in public establishment illegal, how do you enforce this? You can ask the person stop doing it. However, the person can ignore you. Then we expect the courts, we expect police forces to enforce it. Then how come in the case of Rob Ford? Well, it looks like he was above the law. Well, either I have some good news for him or terrible news for him. He's not the exception. This is not news in the sense that every time we look at enforcement, there is something funny that happens. Then when it comes to the enforcement of laws that are supposed to deal with behaviors labeled as vice, there is something tricky. And you have, Susan Morton, who wrote a fantastic book on gambling, how Canadians have dealt with gambling. She wrote something, quite interesting. It is not always easy to determine what has motivated the periodic enforcement of the law. In other words, why, those who are supposed to enforce the law, they seem to do it, not always, but they seem to do it, when they feel like they can do it. Let me show you, some examples coming from the past, and then I'll try to provide you with an answer to why this periodic enforcement of the law. This is the city of Toronto between the period of 1880 and 1930. The number of women who were arrested. Well, 2 things that you may notice. The first one, there is a slight decline. And the second, it's most people who were arrested in Toronto during that time period. Most of them were men. However, if you look at these women, were they married or unmarried, the vast majority of them were unmarried. How come? Well, it looks like when it came time to enforce, the law, well, unmarried women seem to be, targeted. Another example, sex trade. How many times, you may hear people complaining, why are we going after, sex trade workers? Others would say, why are we not going after, sex trade workers? I pay my taxes. I don't want them in front of my yard, my front yard, because it has, negative impact, etc. Well, again, here for 1913, 1915, Well, there were 233 individuals who were arrested, and they were arrested. The other half, more or less, basically the police let them go. And those who were arrested, well, they did receive a minor sentence. Then sex trade workers were quite annoyed by that, but they were also pleased by the fact that, well, the law was not as harsh as it should have been. But for those who were fighting sex trade for whatever reasons, often they believe that sex trade it's not a profession. You could not claim and you should not be proud of being a sex trade worker. Well, of course, for them, police officers were not doing their job. In fact, if they were doing their job, the sex trade, would disappear. One thing we know when it comes to enforcement, and this, applies to many, legislation when it comes to the enforcement of, anti-vice legislation. What we know for sure, in this case, it's about, sex trade. It's women, would be targeted. Often male prostitutes would be ignored. The reason they are being targeted, it's not because police officers do this. Police officers do this in reaction to intense lobby on the part of individuals who feel that, well, there is a law, nobody could be above the law. Well, the law needs to be enforced, and if police officers are reluctant to do it, well, we will do it. We would put pressure. And the whole issue of sex trade and the enforcement of prostitution laws, if there is one thing we know, I was about to say, if there is one thing history has taught us, it's how not only how difficult it is to enforce it, but how reluctant police forces are, because often they feel like, what, this is a minor crime. This is not, it is not like going after murderers, going after sex trade workers. Often police officers feel obligated either by their superior or maybe a new mayor in town, and the mayor said, we would crack down. The other thing we know about sex trade workers, those who work on their own, especially those who would work on the street, often they would be targeted by law enforcement officers. Then why selectivity? Well, something that I like to do is to study public policy. Often scholars prefer to study the development of public policy. Why? Why have we decided to criminalize marijuana? Why have we decided to criminalize or to prohibit alcohol during World War I, etc.? Often we forget to pay attention to the implementation. Once we have decided to prohibit alcohol, how do you implement it? And often we forget to do that. But what we know, it's often factors such as class. Then if you are poor, it is more likely that you will face the law, that you will face police officers. Gender, if you are a woman, it's more likely that you will face the courts or law in general than men. And of course your ethnic background. When it comes again to the example of sex trade, 19th century Toronto, often those who were targeted were Irish women, black women, white women had a tendency to be able to escape the law. Something else that has to do with selectivity and is it a priority or not? And again, when you look at all those behaviors that have been labeled as vice, etc., it is true that when there is a piece of legislation that deals with an issue that has been shaped by a moral understanding of it, such as abortion. Here's a good example, abortion or sex trade work. Enforcement of morality laws is more discretionary than the enforcement of other laws. And it's partially due to the fact that police officers often feel that abortion, well, and again, I know abortion is a very divisive issue because some feel abortion, it's about, it's a crime, and others say it has nothing to do with crime, it's a right. Then leave your values on the side, or don't try to impose them upon others. But police officers, when it came to abortion, Police officers were always reluctant to go after, the physicians who perform abortion, or even, women who sought an abortion. Then victims of morality crimes, such as, drug users or liquor use violators, again, police were often reluctant to go after them. Drug users, to a certain degree, what they are doing, it's more or less, harmless, unless if under the influence of a drug, they commit another crime, then they will be charged because they committed another crime, not because they were under the influence of drug. Same with liquor use violators. I mentioned to you prohibition of alcohol during World War I. When the federal government imposed, the prohibition of alcohol, there was an exception. The exception was if, because of a medical condition, you needed access to alcohol, guess what? You could go see your physician. And what happened, probably the largest movement of civil disobedience in this country, the number of people who went to see a physician because they needed, prescription because of their medical condition. Basically what they needed, to have access to their favorite, liquor. Then again, Mayer, who is a political scientist, does raise an interesting question for us, not only as individuals, but also as Canadians. A strict law without any enforcement will soon be treated as a policy without content. But a moderate law, strictly enforced, can have more impact than a stringent law with sporadic enforcement. Often the issue here is those who push for, the criminalization of abortion or keeping, marijuana as a criminal, in the criminal code, etc. Often those people say, no, we cannot, we have to be serious, because if we decide, to become soft, well, guess what? Society, the way we know it, would go to hell. Last thing I want to do, I just want you to describe, if you want to know more about this whole issue of, good, vice, etc., I just want to describe to you the way the book is being organized. It's a short book. That's the reason it's called a short, Canada, the good. Well, the joke that I like to make about why the book is so short, well, after all, it's about Canada. And as you know, we have a reputation of being, nice people. But anyway, the book starts with, when Europeans arrived here, and they're shocked they had when they encounter, Aboriginals, because in their mind, those Aboriginals, they were human beings, but they were totally different from, Europeans. Then the first chapter deals really with what I call different worlds, different values, this shock that, Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals, Aboriginals were quite surprised by some behaviors that Europeans had, but it was mostly Europeans who were quite shocked by the way Aboriginals live, especially the degree of freedom that Aboriginal women had in comparison to European women. The second chapter, it's really about the colonial era. The third one, it's it's an amazing chapter for the following reason. Really, between 1850 and 1920, you had this large campaign that targeted several, bad behaviors. And really by 1920, many believed that, Canada was on the right path now, because there were so many behaviors that had been labeled as vice that were now, criminalized, gambling, you had, alcohol, you had drugs, etc. And the last chapter is this transformation. As I said, the term vice could still be used by some, but now we tend, to use other terms, and it's partially due to the fact that physicians have now played a crucial role in helping us to understand, for instance, alcoholism. Is this a weakness on the part of an individual, weak character, or is it more maybe a medical, condition, an illness? Same with, gambling. What are you doing with someone who seems to be, he needs to go or she needs, to go and gamble? Then now we have, compulsive, gambling. And it's on this note that I will conclude my presentation. Thank you.